Okay, so back to Freud. So that, now, a lot of what Freud saw was sexual pathology. Now, you might ask yourself, why? Well, the first thing we could point out is that when Freud was alive, society was very highly divided by gender. It was divided by gender roles, and men were authorities and women were by and large subordinate, although that situation is more complex than a simple reading of history might lead you to conclude. So for example, if you read Tolstoy's novels characterizing Russian society in the late 1900s, you find out that among the aristocratic women, and after all, only the aristocrats have power, there was plenty of power being exercised. The women essentially structured society. Men were involved in politics and they were involved in war, but women were setting up the social interactions that characterized the bulk of society in their groups and in their own interactions. So it's not clear who was doing what when. What is clear though is that in the Victorian times, sex was a lot more dangerous for women than it is now. And it's plenty dangerous now. A, there was no reliable forms of birth control. That's a big problem. And B, there was tremendous risk of syphilis. And syphilis, for all intents and purposes, was as bad, or is, as bad or worse than AIDS. Now it's controllable now, but it wasn't controllable then. And syphilis could also be passed on to children. And it was a neurological disease that could take virtually any form. So it was a real terror for European society. And so the reason that the Victorians were sort of repressive in sexual matters was because the environment demanded it.
So I don't think there's any such thing as a casual sexual relationship. I don't believe that. I've never seen any evidence that that's the case. I think that there are people rationalize that constantly because they want to believe that short-term hedonistic gratification is ethically acceptable. And I don't think it is. I think that it trains you to treat yourself and other people as instrumental objects of short-term pleasure, obviously. Mm-hmm. Well, is that how you want to train yourself? How's that going to work? You going to have a long-term relationship at some point? How are you going to train yourself for that? Okay, so having said that, and then how carefully should we conduct ourselves in sexual matters? I would say, well, as carefully as you conduct yourself in any matter of importance, and that stretches all the way up to the top, whatever the top is. You're going to treat the other person as if they're a divine locus of consciousness or a disposable pornographic entity. Well, those are the borders. Okay, but then you say, well, you have to practice. And there's truth in that. And how do you practice? And the answer is, well, that's one of the central complications of life, right? To get the balance between individual action and the whole domain of sexuality and reproduction right is perhaps there's no more difficult question, especially once you've solved the question of do you have enough to eat tomorrow? Mm-hmm. That would be the next one that pops up. Mm-hmm. But I don't think there is such a thing as casual sex. I think that's indistinguishable from masturbation, which I also don't regard as a particularly heroic act. And so, well,
T-shirts, masturbation, right. Not a particularly
right.
act.
And I think people have that sense, and I don't think that that's culturally instantiated, because in some sense we've done everything we can to eradicate every last vestige of sexual shame, which I think in the final analysis is impossible, because there are all sorts of reasons for the persistence of sexual shame that have nothing to do with cultural context. And still, it's a furtive and underground activity. And the reason for that is because it's suboptimal for all sorts of reasons. Well, how much motivation does a young man need to overcome his fear of rejection and establish a relationship with a woman? And the answer to that is, we don't know. But sexual deprivation could easily be part of it. Because to do something difficult, you need a lot of motivation. You need frustration working for you. You need fear working for you. You need lust working for you. You need loneliness working for you. To bind a man and woman together, especially if they're going to produce children, this is a very, very difficult thing to do successfully. And so anything that interferes with that is to be viewed with extreme skepticism, and that's undoubtedly part of the reason that shame around hedonistic sexual activities remains a constant, despite our best attempts to eradicate it. Here's an interesting thing I used to tell my clients is, don't do anything with anyone sexually that you wouldn't talk to them about.
Seems
it's like, well, I wouldn't talk to anybody about that. It's like, but you'll act it out, eh?
Yeah.
So that's worth thinking about. So you're not intimate enough with them to have a conscious discussion, but you're perfectly willing to blunder stupidly into it, and then risk the aftermath. A lot of that's fueled by alcohol too.
Yeah, like a lot of it is fueled, like all of it. You're not going to do that.
If we ever
sober.
wanted to have a serious conversation about sexual impropriety on campuses, for example, the first thing we'd focus on is alcohol. But we don't want to have a serious conversation about that because, we don't want to have, we don't want to have chaperoned parties like there were in the 1950s. It's like, having some older people around to keep the drunken orgy under control actually turns out not to be such a bad idea. Well, that's what you get with alcohol too. And alcohol is a drug that really radically decreases people's medium to long-term orientation, right? It really focuses you on the present, which makes it, if it's a good drug for you, it makes it unbelievably fun because it decreases anxiety and it increases likely opiate bonding and dopamine-mediated extroversion. And so, like, it's cocaine, heroin, and a benzodiazepine rolled into one. And so it makes you not care. And for pure hedonism, there's nothing better than not caring.
Yeah.
But alcohol is a catastrophe on many fronts because of that. And a huge proportion of violent crimes, exploitative crimes, a huge proportion of those are conducted between drunk people. And so, but I don't believe that there is moral casual sex, because I don't think sex is casual. I don't think anything about it is casual. I don't think, that's what I